Ecclesiastes on Wednesday night. And there's a lot of good stuff in these books. Last Sunday morning, we were looking at how Proverbs addressed the subject of health, the health of our body. Of course, we expect Proverbs to address spiritual health, but what Solomon says in Proverbs leads us to understand that it affects our physical health and welfare also. We left off in chapter 13. Chapter 12. Talking about relationships. Look at verse 4. An excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who shames him is like rottenness in his bones. Now, once again, I'll ask, why does Solomon refer to an excellent wife rather than an excellent husband? What's that? She's the helper, but there's something about the context. He's talking to his son. That's what Proverbs is all about. Starts out, Solomon says, I learned this from my dad. By the way, who was his dad? David. David was Solomon's dad. Solomon says, I learned these things from my dad. I'm passing it on to you. And so he's teaching his son this wisdom, and he tells his son, an excellent wife is the crown of her husband, but she who shames him is like rottenness in his bones. What he's talking about is relationships. Some people we understand are really good for us, and other folks are not. Don't shout out any names or point any fingers. But have you ever seen a couple get together and you thought, oh, I hope they don't stay together because she's not right for him or he's not right for her, or one doesn't deserve the other, and you wanted to step in and do something about it? This is the kind of situation that Solomon's addressing, when you can see, oh, she's a crank or he's no good, and you'd like to do something. And Solomon is saying, don't wait for somebody else to tell you that. You pay attention. And you look for a good wife or husband, because what he's saying is it affects your physical health, rottenness in the bones. I don't think that is just a figurative allusion to your life won't be very happy. I think really he's talking about how your physical health will be affected, because so many other things that we've looked at and so many other things we will look at address this idea of your physical health being affected by your spiritual and emotional well-being. Any commentary on this? Yes, Bill.
You can't be wrong. Norma, big judge of people, she knew this family. She didn't want her best son married a girl, but he did. She changed to be one of the best daughter-in-laws we've ever had.
All right.
So you better be careful.
You better be careful. Don't you wish Solomon had another verse that said, this is how you can tell who an excellent woman's going to be or who an excellent man's going to be? And really he does, to some degree, when you look into people's lives. But one of the things about knowing somebody for a long time is you really get to know them over a longer span better if you're paying attention. Also, well, let me ask you, what are some things that tell you the reality about a person and their outlook on life? What are some things you look for? Let's say most of us are a little older, a little more mature. If your son or your daughter is going to start dating somebody, let's just assume you've got one that's in the dating arena. Oh, we'll call it an arena because it's like a fight. What would you tell them to look for in the person they're dating? Not just personal qualities, but what other things might be observable? Cosmetic dress, okay. Oh, how they do their makeup and how they do their dress. Okay.
How they relate to other people.
How they relate to other people. Any specific people? Christians, how they relate to Christians. What do they think of Christians and Christianity? Oh, if they are Christians, okay.
Integrity.
How they relate to their parents. Does he respect his mom? Does he listen to his dad? Those kinds of things.
Integrity.
Their integrity. Now, when you talk about integrity, what might you look for to determine a person's integrity?
Honesty.
Honesty. Have they been honest with you?
And with other people, too.
Yes. I don't know about this, but one of the things I've found about people who are not honest, there seems to be in a lot of them a sense of pride in their ability to dupe others, and they might just come right out and tell you, thinking that you're going to admire them. I remember a couple in Leavenworth, Kansas, that got their children into a particular school by lying about it. And they told us, like, oh, you're really going to think we're fantastic people because, hey, look how we got them in. We told them a lie. They didn't know any better. Aren't we smart? And I thought, aren't you godless? Somebody else.
Marty,
Yes, Jim.
a lot of times if your children are raised like they should be, and I guess I was lucky with mine, son, but a lot of my girls, a lot of those red flags were raised by them, without me having, their mother having to say anything.
Yeah.
Of course, we counsel them along the way when they ask and try to, but you'd be surprised at a young person who the red flags after so long and went through school and high school and all that, there'll be a lot of red flags that come up on their own.
Yes.
You'll see.
And that shows that they've got some values instilled in them. One of the things I found, when you're honestly looking, when you have a purpose to look for what other people are really all about, you begin to get some perspective in what you are really all about. And so this isn't just a matter of, if you got a good wife, you're going to be better off, and if you got a bad wife, well, it's going to be hard. There's more to it than that when you think about it. How are you going to find a good wife? If you're just shopping for a car, you know what you're looking for in a car when you go to the car lot, don't you? You better. Or else you're going to get sold something that they want you to have rather than what you want to have. Anybody ever had that happen to you? When you go to the car lot, you better know, okay, we want something comfortable. It's got to seat 5 people or however many people. It's got to get this kind of mileage. It can't be above this price range. It's got to have a third dot over from the right on reliability if you're talking about Consumer Guide or whatever it is. You got all these things you're looking for in a car. We ought to do that with people as well. All right, any more commentary on this? Yes, Bill.
The girl we were in doubt about wouldn't finish school over here in Choctaw until her mother and dad gave her a new car. And they gave her a new car and she finished school. Pretty selfish kid, but she grew up after that. She was going to grow.
You can't predict everything, can you? No?
Marty,
Yes.
one passage that might parallel well with this is the 14th chapter of Proverbs in verse 30. It says, "A friend full of heart is life to the body, with passion is rottenness to the bones." And this may be the other side. Passion may be on the part of the male, and parallel with 1 John 2:15. The lust of the flesh and the lust of the eye and the vainglory of life is not of the Father. And the 14th chapter starts with the wise woman builds her house. So it may be addressed to women in particular, and then it's the man's side. And if he's just looking for passion, that can become rottenness to the bone.
I had planned to connect 29 and 30, because this is what 14:29 says. He who is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who is quick-tempered exalts folly. A tranquil heart is life to the body, but passion is rottenness to the bones. Now there is passion in the sense of an attraction to somebody else, but there's also passion in the sense of intense emotion, which is, I think Solomon's equating that with the anger of verse 29. If you know somebody and they are easily angered, you got to be careful around that. Because if they're easily angered with other things going on, once they get comfortable with you, guess what? They're going to be easily angered with you. And what he's telling us is, if you're slow to anger, you have what? According to the passage, patience is one thing, great understanding. So if somebody is not slow to anger, what do they probably not have? They probably don't have great understanding. I don't know if you've spent much time around people who do not understand or try to understand or value the ability to understand, but that can be miserable because they'll look at everything you do with a skeptical eye, and anything you do that's not exactly right or anything you do that might show weakness, they're not going to give you any grace, any mercy. That's just because they don't have any understanding. And without understanding, you don't have compassion. You don't have a lot of the things that you need in life. So there's got to be some degree of understanding, and if somebody's angry all the time, they lack understanding, is what Solomon is saying. And that equates to the passion. And then he says in verse 30, a tranquil heart. And people who are angry all the time don't have tranquil hearts. It's like there's always a turmoil bubbling right below the surface. And a tranquil heart is life to the body. But passion, this fomenting emotion, is rottenness to the bones. Trying to put all this together because we in life have to judge ourselves to know what changes we need to make and what adjustments need to be put in place. And to a certain degree, we have to judge others when it comes to our relationships, especially people we want to incorporate into the family, which is where we got started with this in 12:4. All right, back to chapter 12. Another passage in chapter 12 is verse 18. There's one who speaks rashly like the thrusts of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. What do you think of that imagery? The thrusts of a sword. Rash words, just stab you. Hurtful, painful. How does the tongue of the wise bring healing? Have you ever seen that happen?
And also comfort you whenever you have a troublesome issue. I have found that, maybe I'm too quick to judge, but if I get around somebody that is cursing or something like that, I really back off away from them, and I just, don't want to be with those people. So I think when you start thinking about a Christian person and who you want to associate with, that's one of the things that tells me it's a turn off.
Do y'all think she's being judgmental when she doesn't want to be around people that curse?
Well, anyway.
I think you're being judgmental, but I think it's a very good judgment. They sell these boots down at Bass Pro called snake boots. Why would they sell boots called snake boots? Because snakes bite. And if you get near a snake and you may not know it, they might bite you. Solomon says that the tongue of those who speak rashly is like a sword thrusting out. To me, it's like a snake bite too. It's the same kind of a thing. You're not really ready for it, but there it is. Got you, stabbed you, bit you. Why would you want to be around somebody who behaves like that? And you got that on one hand, somebody whose tongue is injurious who will stab you, and then you've got the tongue of the wise. When do you normally need the tongue of the wise? All the time, yes, all the time. But the scenario I think about, when I think about really needing the tongue of the wise, is when you have maybe listened to the tongue of the stupid. And you've gotten yourself in a mess. and now I'm in a mess and I need some help. And that's when you really need the counsel. We need the wise counsel all the time. We need the tongue of the wise all the time to keep us out of the bad situations. But when you're in that bad situation, you need some help and need some healing. And probably you don't just need the situation to be rectified, but you need somebody to reassure you, you're going to be okay. You're going to be fine. I learned years ago, and I don't know if they still do this in the medical field, and some of you who may have practiced or been trained in medicine might know this. Aren't you supposed to reassure the patient all the time? Does anybody know? I thought that was one of the things they trained them in, always reassure the patient. Don't tell them, well, it looks pretty bad. I think you're going to bleed to death, but we'll do everything we can. That just doesn't make sense. And to reassure people, and with God, are you ever out of hope when there's God involved? Never. There's always hope. And so the tongue of the wise would lead people towards God, and when you lead people towards God, you lead people towards hope, towards understanding, towards this idea that you really are valued. It doesn't matter what you've said or what you've done. Even though the outcome here in front of us might be horrible, with God there's hope. And maybe we can't fix all of this, but you are not lost. You can be saved, you can be reclaimed, and you can go on to do well. The tongue of the wise always brings healing, but those who speak rashly, it's like the thrust of a sword. And I think that's a warning to each of us as well, because I don't know about you, but there are times when I just think, I'm just going to say it. Because I feel it, so I'm just going to say it. You ever done that and regretted it? Well, you can't bring them back once they're out there. You get those words out in front of you, they are just gone. All right, still in chapter 12, look at verse 25. Anxiety in a man's heart weighs it down, but a good word makes it glad. So one thing takes it down, another thing brings it up. Where's the anxiety come from? Does it come from God? Does God give us anxiety? If it doesn't come from God, it's got to come from somewhere else, and anywhere else but God's not good. What does Jesus say about worry? What examples did he use? He takes care of us, like the birds of the field. What did he say about the birds? They don't sow, they don't reap, but your heavenly Father feeds them. And I like what somebody said years ago. He said, yeah, God feeds the birds, but he doesn't throw it into the nest. In other words, there's some obligation on the part of the bird. There's some obligation on our part to do well so that we might reap the benefits of doing well. But when we're doing well, God's going to provide for us. That's what Jesus says. What other example besides the birds did Jesus use? The lilies of the field. And we may not think of these things so much because there's probably not anybody here. I hope there's not. Let me know if there is. But there's probably not anybody here who's really worried, where am I going to eat lunch today? We don't have any food. Talk to me when you're done here, when we're done here today, if that's your situation. But people in Christ's day did have that situation. They were worried, well, this is the only garment I've got. And it's getting kind of thin. And when it wears out, what am I going to do? And besides, it's starting to get cold. It's tending towards the fall or towards the winter. And I don't have a whole wardrobe of clothes in my house to go pick out something. Like most of us probably do. Don't you take winter clothes and put them in another room and put your summer clothes in? And when the summer's coming to an end, you pull your summer clothes out, put them in another closet, put your winter clothes in place to wear your winter clothes. And you're going through throwing stuff away, giving it to Goodwill because you got so much. That's the way most of us are in America. It wasn't always like that. And people worried about what they were going to wear, and they worried about if they were going to have food. And Jesus said, don't worry about those things. Do what you need to do to get what you need, but put your trust in God. Peter, if you want to keep a finger there in Proverbs, go to 1 Peter chapter 5. Because this anxiety it's a huge problem for humanity. And if we understand God's perspective on the world, and especially on us, to me it's a great stress and mind reliever. And this was true in Solomon's day, just like it's true now. 1 Peter chapter 5, look at verse 5. It says, "You younger men likewise be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." So here's what you can do. Humble yourself and have humility towards each other. It's not enough just to have humility towards God. Have humility towards each other. And then he says in verse 6, "Therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may do what? Exalt you." When? In due time. Humble yourself before God because he wants to lift you up. And then he says in verse 7, casting all your, what does your translation say? Care. What do some other translations? Anxiety. If you've got anxiety, if you've got care, if you've got worry, if you've got troubles, humble yourself before God and give him all of that stuff. And what's going to happen? It says to do it because he cares for you, but what that means is he's going to care for you. He cares for you, so he's going to take your cares and your anxieties and think about it from his perspective. He's trying to teach us, this is what I want you to do. I want you to pray to me. I want you to humble yourselves and pray to me because I care for you. And when we do that, he's not going to say, "Oh, great, you got it. You prayed to me," and then walk off and forget about us. If you humble yourself before God and cast your anxiety on him, he's going to do something about that. He wants to exalt you, not just somebody somewhere who's obscure and vague that's unknown. He wants to exalt you. He wants to lift you up. Just like you want to teach and train your children. Don't you want your children to turn out better than you? I hope you've thought about that. I hope there's nobody here saying, "Well, I'm not sure. I'd feel bad if they turned out better than me." I hope you're thinking, "I want my kids to be better than me. I want to teach them and train them. I want to provide for them." And sometimes we don't know exactly what we should provide because we want them to have a better life. And it's funny how that turned out. My parents were some of those parents raised in the Depression era when hardly anybody had anything, but they said, "Well, we didn't know we were poor because everybody was poor." And they walked 14 miles to school both ways, uphill in the snow, with a cold potato in their pocket for lunch if they had potatoes, and cardboard in their shoes because the holes were forming in their shoes if they had shoes. Now, some of that's made up. Some of it's not. You know, all those things that we have fun talking about are based in a reality and in a hardship that people knew. And so when things changed and they got away from that bad economy and the times got better, what did they want to do for their children? I don't want our kids to lack for anything. And so they started lavishing everything on their children, and it doesn't always work out the best when you give people too much. But this, you can't give your kids too much of this. Too much training in Scripture, too much training in the Bible. You can't relate to them too much wisdom. Just can't get enough of it, really, is the bottom line. And so we worry about things, and it doesn't matter how much stuff you've got. If you haven't learned to trust in God, you're going to worry about it, whether you have little or whether you have much. And you don't have to be rich to be concerned about money all the time. I've known poor people that were just as concerned about money that anybody was that was rich. And why was it? Well, they didn't trust God. All right, where are we? Chapter 13, verse 12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. What does it mean, deferred? What's that? It's put off. You thought you were going to get it, and no, you don't get it. It's deferred. It's taken away from you. You don't have access to whatever your hope was that you wanted to have fulfilled. What happens when your hope is deferred? It makes your heart sick. What's the counter? Desire fulfilled is what? A tree of life. What does that mean, tree of life? What's the imagery there? How does that impact our lives on a practical level? Is that just some poetic thing Solomon said, tree of life, or is there a reality to that? What were Adam and Eve cast out of the garden for? Now we know it was sin, but what did God want to keep them from? Tree of life. Eating from the tree of life. If we don't kick them out of the garden, they'll have access to the tree of life and they'll live forever. And what had God told them? He said, when you eat the forbidden fruit, the fruit of knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. And so Solomon is letting us know, when you have a hope, and he's talking about a legitimate hope. I don't think he's talking about some hope in something bad that we wanted, but something good, something right. When you have that kind of a hope and you realize that hope, it's a tree of life. It gives you hope. It instills a sense of confidence in life. Otherwise, your heart becomes sick when your hope is deferred. Now, let's talk about this a little bit. What are some of the things that we hope in? Just in humanity in general, what are some of the things in which people put their hope?
Their education.
Education, yes. A lot of people put their hopes in education, and the more education you've got, the more degrees, the more letters after your name. By the way, is there anything wrong with education? No, not a thing wrong with education. We all better get some. Why are we here? Trying to get some education. Education is good, but some people put all their hope in education. What are some other things people put their hope
Money
in?
and fame.
Money and fame?
Government.
Oh. Fewer and fewer. Yes, some put their hope into government.
Hobbies.
Hobbies, yes. Put all their time, all their energy, all their hope in their hobbies, that this is going to fulfill my life.
I believe out sports.
Sports, put all their hope in sports. If the Thunder wins, it's going to be a good week. If the Thunder doesn't win, oh man. Now, what should we really put our hope in?
Hope of eternal life.
Hope of eternal life. And where's eternal life come from? It comes from God. If we will commit ourselves to the singular thought of putting our hope in God and no one or nothing else, our hope will never be deferred. When Jesus was in the garden, what did he pray for? It's not a trick question. He said, Father, if it be your will, take this cup from me. What did he not want to have to go through? Didn't want to have to die. I don't know that he was just worried about the physical aspect of the crucifixion. I'm sure he was, but I think perhaps he was even more concerned about the spiritual and emotional impact of the crucifixion and whatever separation from God meant when he said, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? Or my God, my God. All of that was coming to bear on him. All of the sin of the world was coming to bear on him. And he said, not let this cup pass, but if it is your will. So what was his hope in? It was in God, and God's wisdom and God's will, and having God's will fulfilled in his life. Was his hope deferred? Now somebody might see that prayer, oh yeah, his hope was deferred because the cup didn't pass. Oh no, his hope was fully fulfilled because what was his primary desire? For God's will to be done. That was his primary desire. Whatever God's will was going to cost him, that's okay because I really want God's will to be done more than anything else. If that's the approach we have to life, our hope will never be deferred because no matter what happens to you, it's just like James said in James chapter 1. What are we supposed to do when we fall into various trials? Count it all joy. Count it all joy when something bad happens to you, because the testing of your faith works patience, and patience has a perfect result. And that's what we're looking for God to work in our lives and bring about something good. David?
Colossians 1:27 states, Christ in you, the hope of glory. So the mighty good hope is to build Christ on our faith.
Yes. And when you have God, do you really lack anything? Nothing. He spoke the universe into existence. And he has total control, not just over the physical universe, but over the spiritual aspects of the universe, which is the only part that's going to last. All of the physical is going to eventually be burned up. It won't last. All of our houses, all of our boats, all of our guns, it's going to go.
That scripture reminds you of Christ was human. He was a man and he was God. The man, human side was suffering. God's side of it, absolutely pure right.
Right. We make our plans, and we really want to fulfill our plans. But if in the back of our mind, what we're really thinking is, I would rather have God's will done in my life than for my own plans to be fulfilled, then it's going to be okay when something happens and our plans don't get fulfilled. We will not lose hope. We will not be downtrodden. We will not be disheartened if we keep the idea that whatever's happening, God is going to, according to Romans 8:28, make everything work together for good. And that has to mean the bad stuff, because the good stuff is already working for good. So he's got to be talking about the things we would see as bad. Romans 8:28 is always present with us. How did I get off on this? Was it a legitimate take from 13:12? Our hope being deferred or our hope being realized? That's what he's talking about there. And if your hope is fulfilled, it's a tree of life. So put your hope in God. Put your trust in him. Chapter 13, verse 17. How in the world does that apply to our lives? Can you think of any way that applies? Does it address the issue of health? Alan?
One example is back when King David, when Saul's demise came about, there was a messenger that brought David the news. And he thought he was bringing David good news, that he told him that Saul was dead. But that messenger fell on a bad way.
Oh yeah. As a matter of fact, was the message that the messenger brought even totally true? I mean, Saul had died, but what did the messenger say?
That he had killed him.
That he had killed him. How did Saul actually die?
Fell on his own.
Killed himself. So this guy comes back. He's not a faithful messenger. He's going to say that Saul died, but he's not going to say that Saul died by his own hand. And he didn't come back and report, "O king, live forever. The one against whom you lifted up your hand, God has lifted up his hand." I think David would have rewarded that man if he'd have done it like that. But he wasn't a faithful messenger. Even having bad news, he wasn't a faithful messenger. When you said that, when you started talking about David, I thought, oh, he's going to talk about who else was in David's life who was a faithful messenger and who brought healing. What happened with Bathsheba? And who straightened that out? Or who approached David to get that straightened out? The prophet Nathan. What did Nathan tell David?
He did wrong.
I can just see him putting his finger in his face. You're the man. You took this little ewe lamb from this guy who only had one ewe lamb, and you stole it from him. And you got all the lambs in the world. When David heard that story, he was ready to bring the guy who'd stolen that little ewe lamb to justice. And then he found out, oh, he's the one who needs to come to justice. And what started at that point, when David had that realization, was healing. We're going to get this fixed. We're going to get it straightened out. Everything couldn't be put back in place. He'd already done the lies. He'd already done the fornication. Bathsheba was already with child. Uriah was already dead. All those things had happened. But the healing started. And I think the healing, well, I'm glad you brought that up. If you go back to Psalms 50, this psalm was almost certainly written by David based on the whole mess with Bathsheba. Oh, 51. I'm a psalm off. Look at verse 10. Just imagine David writing this based on his self-examination of all he'd done in his sin with Bathsheba and Uriah. So create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and sustain me with a willing spirit. Then I will teach transgressors your ways, and sinners will be converted to you. Deliver me from blood guiltiness, O God, the God of my salvation. Then my tongue will joyfully sing of your righteousness. O Lord, open my lips that my mouth may declare your praise. For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You're not pleased with burnt offerings. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. When did the healing start for David? It was when he faced his sin. And so the faithful messenger, Nathan, confronted David with his sin, and that's when things started to get turned around and come back towards healing. What if Nathan had never approached David? What if David had never been confronted with what he had done? What do you suppose would have happened eventually? I can't imagine how bad that would have been. But thanks be to God, it didn't happen because there was a faithful messenger. A faithful messenger brings healing. And it doesn't have to be good news. It just has to be right news, accurate news, a word that's honest and true that we need to hear, whether it's fun to hear or not fun to hear, pleasant or unpleasant, whether it stings or whether it comforts. A faithful messenger brings healing. Are any of us messengers? Aren't we supposed to be messengers, each one of us?
Yes.
With the message of the gospel? The telling of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the telling of his love for us, but also just the telling people that we care about them and we value them by speaking to them with a smile, by giving a good word, a comforting word, treating them with dignity and respect, showing them that we value them as God values them. Yes?
I think a very subtle and maybe more practical indication of this wicked message that American adversity would relate to the brothers of Joseph when they came back to Jacob and told him that, look this coat over. They pulled an undercover job in order to deceive and cover up what they had done. And if you fast forward then to when they come down into Egypt later and begin talking to Joseph, there are about 5 expressions to indicate that 20 years later, those brothers felt totally guilty. They had gone through not only the departure of their own folly, but they had seen Jacob grieve for all those years. And the whole picture is adversity in an unnecessary way.
Right.
And this is kind of a subtle kind. You might try to get away with it. But they live with it day and night. 20 years they have hurt over what they've done.
And then the fear when they realized Joseph is alive. And if Joseph's alive, what's going to happen to us?
That's the war later.
Yeah, it never stopped until Joseph finally confronted them. He became the faithful messenger to them. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. So it's over. It's done. Your part is done. God has done his part. Rest at ease. And I don't know if the only way they could have at that point is if they had put their hope in God rather than in themselves. And that's something I think we need to say. We all want to do right. But don't put too much hope in your own doing of right, because when you fail to do right and you get caught in it, then you might give up hope. Well, I really did bad, so I'll probably never do really good again. No. Put your hope in God. Trust in him that he will be gracious to you, that he'll give you mercy, and that with grace and mercy you can move on through life, and you can eventually learn to do better. It's not just about learning to do better, but it's really about putting your faith in God. And if my faith is in my own performance, it's like some people are in athletics. And rightly so in athletics. You know, if you need to run a certain speed to be good as a tight end, and you don't run that fast anymore, what should you do? I mean, talking about professional sports. Then your coach is probably going to say, and your manager is going to say, and the team owner is probably going to say, oh, we can't use him anymore because he's just not fast enough. But it's not like that spiritually. Spiritually, you get better and better all the time. What's happening to the outward man? It's perishing. What's happening to the inward man? It's being renewed day by day, day by day. So put your hope in God rather than even your own righteousness. Harold?
Well, I was going to say, I think it's really important to put your faith in God in good times and bad times. So we're not just trying to rely on God when we need help, but every day, every aspect of our life really lets us put our hope in God, because he's always there. And I think we can avoid a lot of difficulties if we just do that on a regular basis all the time rather than just occasionally.
Exactly. Oh, you made me think of that poem. I wish I had a copy of it to read to you because it's hilarious. But it's about this rancher in Montana. I think it's Montana. It doesn't really matter where it is. But he's out in the cold and a big blizzard's coming in. And he says, man, I got to get back. I'm going to freeze out here. So he gets in his truck and he cranks it. It won't start. So he prays, Lord, please start my truck. And truck didn't start. He died. He went up to the pearly gates and he's talking to Peter. And he says, what happened? I prayed and God didn't start my truck. And Peter, well, let me check the records. And he looks back in the records and says, well, we hadn't heard from you in so long, we forgot who you were. So we started a truck in Wyoming. And that's kind of the same thing. God needs to know who we are. So talk to him all the time, even when things are going great. Give thanks and praise when things are going great, so that you don't feel bad when you go to him when things aren't going great. Thank you so much for your participation and your presence here this morning. We'll come back next week, Lord willing.